Ramiro Salcedo signed the paper without lifting his eyes, because he knew that if he looked at his brother's face in that moment, something inside him would break in a way that could never be fixed again. His hand trembled, not from the morning cold, but from what he was about to lose. Outside, the Michoacan sun barely touched the hills as the notary slid the documents into his worn leather folder. Everything his father, Don Aurelio Salcedo, had built, the ranch, the avocado groves, the corrals, even the old chapel where both brothers had been baptized, now belonged, in that instant, to Rodolfo alone. You were never anyone's favorite, Ramiro. At least now you have the truth in front of you. Rodolfo said it without hurry, the way a man straightens a chair, not the way a man drives in a knife. And yet that was exactly what he had done. Ramiro had cared for their father for the last 4 years, as the illness slowly ate away his memory, the way water eats away at a ravine. He had slept in a chair beside his bed more nights than he could count. Rodolfo, meanwhile, visited twice a year, bringing expensive gifts and even more expensive words, and left before the smell of the ranch could cling to his clothes. But the will that had surfaced, signed barely 2 weeks before Don Aurelio died, when he could hardly remember his own name, left everything to Rodolfo. For having managed the family's affairs, the paper read. Ramiro knew his father would never have written that. By then his father could barely hold a spoon. Cousin Herminia, who had come to witness the proceedings, lowered her eyes when Rodolfo said that, and said nothing. She saw Ramiro's hands tremble. She saw him stay silent, and she left without a word, like someone who doesn't want to get her hands dirty with someone else's business. The notary, a young man who barely knew the family, cleared his throat uncomfortably before filing the last copy. "Everything is in order," he said, without looking directly at either brother, as if he himself doubted his own words. Ramiro noticed that not even Rodolfo could meet the man's eyes as he took the papers, and for a moment he thought that maybe, deep down, his brother knew perfectly well that something there wasn't right. "You have until Friday to get your things out of the house," Rodolfo added, already tucking their father's pocket watch into his vest, the same watch Don Aurelio had promised Ramiro when he was a boy. "It's only fair. Legally, none of this is yours anymore." Ramiro only nodded. He didn't beg. He didn't raise his voice. He gathered the things that were truly his: a change of clothes, his work boots, the old photograph of his mother, and walked out to the porch, where Centavo, the thin cinnamon-colored dog he'd raised from a pup, waited wagging his tail, unaware that his owner's whole world had just come apart that morning. He walked the 11 kilometers to town with the sack over his shoulder and the dog trotting beside him, never complaining, looking back only once, when the red roof of the ranch was still visible among the avocado trees. He found shelter in the one thing left of his life before Rodolfo, the old adobe house of his godfather, Refugio Bautista, a 70-year-old man who had worked the Salcedo land for more than 4 decades and now lived alone, with arthritic hands and a patience that seemed to have no bottom. "There's room here," was all Refugio said when he saw him arrive, without asking what had happened, because he could already guess. He poured him coffee in a chipped tin cup and pointed him to the cot in the back room. Centavo lay down by the door, as if he already knew that was now his post to guard. The house smelled of burnt wood and earthy soap, a humble smell that first night, felt more like home to Ramiro than the entire ranch he'd just been thrown out of. Outside, the crickets sang as if nothing in the world had changed, and inside, on the bare table, an oil lamp gave off just enough light for Ramiro to make out his godfather's weathered hands. The same hands that had worked the Salcedo land a whole lifetime without ever asking for more than what was fair. What Ramiro didn't know was that very afternoon, while he slept the first peaceful nap he'd had in weeks, Centavo would start scratching at the loose earth behind Refugio's henhouse, as if something buried there had been calling to him for years. The first days passed slowly, marked by small new routines. Every morning, before sunrise, Ramiro helped Refugio milk the 2 thin cows he had left and gather firewood for the fire. Every morning, too, Centavo would disappear for a while toward that same corner behind the henhouse and come back with his snout full of dirt. "That dog's got his mind somewhere else," Refugio said the third time he saw it happen, serving Ramiro a plate of beans with a tortilla fresh off the comal. "Either he's plain crazy, or he's looking for something." Ramiro didn't think much of it at first. He had other things on his mind: how he was going to support himself, whether he should look for work on another ranch or stay and help Refugio with what little there was. His father's ranch, now Rodolfo's, could be seen from the highest hill in town, and Ramiro avoided looking that way whenever he went out walking. The routine settled in on its own, without anyone naming it. At dawn, Refugio warmed coffee in the same old tin pot, and Ramiro split firewood while the sun barely striped the distant hills. By mid-morning, the 2 men checked the corral fence together, and in the afternoons Ramiro would sit a while on the porch, Centavo lying at his feet, mending what could be mended of his old life. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that carried a different weight. One afternoon, Doa Eulalia, Refugio's neighbor of 30 years, came by with a basket of eggs and a piece of cheese wrapped in an embroidered napkin. "I heard what happened, son," she told Ramiro, without needing him to explain anything. "Nobody around here is going to let you go hungry, that's for sure." She left the basket on the table and left almost without saying goodbye, like someone who doesn't want to be thanked for a gesture that, to her, was simply what neighbors owed each other. That same week, Don Casimiro brought a sack of corn he had extra, and the baker's son from town started leaving an extra roll at Refugio's door every couple of days, never saying who it was from. Little by little, Ramiro understood that the whole town knew exactly what had happened at that ranch, and that people's silence wasn't indifference. It was simply their way of taking a side. There was one night, though, when his composure cracked. Ramiro sat alone on the porch after Refugio had already gone to bed, and cried quietly, face in his hands, thinking of his father, of the nights he'd spent caring for him, of the watch his brother now carried in his pocket. Centavo came over slowly and rested his head on Ramiro's knee, without barking, without asking for anything, just staying there. Ramiro took a deep breath, wiped his face with his sleeve, and by the time Refugio came out to see why the dog hadn't come in, he was already on his feet again, dry-eyed, his back straight. Meanwhile, scattered news of the ranch kept arriving, always through others, that Rodolfo had brought in a new foreman from outside, because none of the old workers wanted to take his orders willingly, that he'd thrown out 2 families who'd lived on the lower land for generations, without giving them a single peso in compensation. That at the town cantina, whenever someone mentioned Ramiro's name, Rodolfo changed the subject, or got up and left. That Sunday, as every week, the town gathered in front of the chapel after Mass, and for the first time since he'd been thrown out, Ramiro found the courage to go. No one singled him out. No one asked uncomfortable questions. Quite the opposite. The old sexton squeezed his shoulder as he passed, and 2 young men who had once worked for his father came over to greet him with a respect they used to reserve only for Don Aurelio. A woman gave him a bundle of fragrant herbs so Refugio's house can smell of something good, she said, and walked off, smiling. It was there, sitting on the stone bench outside the chapel, Centavo lying in the shade of the churchyard's lone ash tree, that Ramiro understood something he'd spent weeks unable to put into words, that he had lost the ranch, the family name on a piece of paper, even his father's watch. But the whole town still saw him as exactly who he had always been. That, he thought, no one could take from him, not with all the signed papers in the world. It was Refugio who one afternoon placed in his hands a patched blanket that had belonged to Ramiro's mother, kept all those years, in a trunk. "Your mother gave me this before she died, so I could keep it for you until the day you needed it," the old man told him, his voice cracking just slightly. "I never knew when that day would come. I think it's today." Ramiro held it against his chest like a man holding the only thing left of an entire life. One afternoon, as the two men were repairing a fallen fence, Don Casimiro arrived, Refugio's old friend and the ranch's former foreman, with news from town. They say Rodolfo's already talking to a buyer from Morelia. He wants to sell the whole avocado grove, the whole property. Says there's nothing left here to hold him back. Refugio clenched his jaw at that, but said nothing in front of Ramiro. That night, however, Ramiro heard him praying quietly in front of the small image of the Virgin he kept in his room, asking, as far as he could make out, that God set things right before it was too late. One early morning, Centavo wouldn't let anyone sleep. He barked and scratched behind the henhouse with such insistence that Refugio, fed up, got up with the oil lamp to see what was going on. "This dog's not going to stop until we listen to him," he muttered, more resigned than annoyed, and motioned for Ramiro to bring the shovel. They dug for nearly an hour under the lamp's dim glow, Centavo circling them the whole time as if supervising the work. The shovel struck something hard, and Ramiro, on his knees now, pulled out with his bare hands a wooden box wrapped in waxed cloth, remarkably well preserved for however many years it had spent underground. But what Ramiro didn't yet realize was that inside that box was something that would change his life and his brother's in a way neither of them could ever undo. Inside, wrapped in a clean cloth, were several yellow documents and a folded letter in his father's unmistakable handwriting, dated almost 20 years earlier, long before the illness. Ramiro opened it with trembling hands, and Refugio brought the lamp closer so he could read. The letter explained what neither son had ever known, that Don Aurelio, long before falling ill, had drawn up a different will, the true, original one, dividing the ranch equally between his two sons, with one special clause: the land where the spring was, the water source that fed every avocado grove in the region, would go to whichever son had cared for him until the end, not whichever one had inherited his name. There was more. A second document, notarized in the capital and kept there as a precaution, proved that the recent will, the one Rodolfo had presented, bore a signature that, by that date, Don Aurelio could no longer have made without help. The handwriting shook in a way the original notary himself, before his death, had noted down as suspicious. "Your father wasn't a fool," Refugio said, his eyes shining under the lamp's light. "He knew something like this could happen. That's why he asked me to keep this somewhere no one would find it, until it was needed." He looked over at the dog, already lying calmly beside the box, as if his job were done. "And it looks like Centavo understood it was needed before the rest of us did." Ramiro reread the letter twice more that early morning, unable to sleep, searching every word for his father's voice, the one he'd nearly forgotten after all those sick years. He recognized, finally, turns of phrase his father had always used. God first, so that hard-earned things don't get lost, and that alone was enough to lift the fear of being wrong off his chest. The next day, the news began moving through town the way water moves between stones, slow but unstoppable. Refugio spoke with the notary who had attended to Don Aurelio during his last lucid years, an old man himself now, who recognized his own handwriting on the buried document and confirmed, without hesitation, that it was the true will. He pulled out a copy from his personal files, kept out of habit, somewhat yellowed by now, and compared it line by line with the one Ramiro had brought. They matched in every detail, down to the ink stain in the bottom corner. "I drafted this document myself almost 20 years ago," the old notary said, adjusting his glasses. "And I can assure you, young man, that the one presented at my office a few months ago did not carry the signature of a man capable of signing anything on his own. I told the person who brought it so at the time, but they didn't want to listen." 3 days passed before Rodolfo showed up at Refugio's house, his face flushed, his voice louder than the town had ever heard from him. "That's worth nothing," he said, standing in the doorway, uninvited. "An old paper dug up by some farmhand doesn't undo what's already signed before a notary. The notary who's going to say otherwise is sitting in his office right now, waiting for you," Refugio answered, without raising his voice, without moving from where he stood. "And it wasn't some farmhand who found it. It was a dog your father treated better than you. Some days." Rodolfo looked at Ramiro, searching perhaps for that same lowered gaze, that same lifelong silence. But he found something else instead. "I never wanted to fight you over this," Ramiro said, his voice steady but without theatrical bitterness. "I just wanted someone, at some point, to see what really happened during those years. You don't have to be the one who sees it anymore. God already has, and the judge will, soon enough." Don Casimiro, who had come with Rodolfo, lowered his head in shame and said nothing in his own defense. Rodolfo looked at him, searching for support, and found none there either. "This isn't over," he managed to say, without his earlier certainty. "I'll appeal. I'll find another lawyer. This doesn't end here." "Appeal all you like," Refugio replied, without raising his voice even a degree. "But the whole town already knows what kind of man got a sick father to sign a paper he couldn't understand, and what kind of man slept 4 years in a chair out of nothing but love. No lawyer can change that." The silence of the whole town weighed heavier than any shout. 2 neighbors who had come to watch from the gate lowered their eyes, and one of the women crossed herself quietly, without a word. Rodolfo stood there a moment longer, searching for something to say, and found nothing. He left without saying goodbye, his father's watch still in his pocket, but without the certainty he'd arrived with. Never underestimate the quiet brother who stays to care for someone after everyone else has already left. Months later, once the court confirmed what the letter and the second document had already proven, Ramiro returned to the ranch, not as a man claiming revenge, but as one returning to a place he could finally call his own again. The scent of ripe avocados filled the afternoon air, mixed with the smoke from the fire Refugio had already lit in the yard, now his home too. Centavo ran between the rows as if he'd been born for that exact moment, barking with joy, while the hens returned to the coop at sunset, and the cows lowed in the distance. Fat now. Calm. Now, the smell of ripe avocado mixed with fresh coffee and the bread Doa Eulalia had sent over that same afternoon, as if she wanted to be the first to celebrate that the house finally had an owner again. Ramiro sat in the porch chair, the same one where his father used to watch the sunset, his mother's patched blanket folded over his knees. "Did you know all of this from the start?" he asked Refugio that night, as they ate dinner at the long porch table. "I knew your father wasn't a man to leave things unsettled," the old man answered, pouring coffee. "I just hoped God would send someone, or something, that knew where to look. Sometimes life's most desperate moments are exactly the ones God uses to set things right, even if it takes years for them to fall into place. Has the person or the creature you least expected ever turned out to be the one who needed you most, and the one who saved you in the end?" If this story touched something in your heart, don't forget to leave your comment. Hit like and subscribe to Cuentos del Viejo Campo so you never miss a story. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet loyalty always comes to light, sooner or later. I've already got another story waiting for you. That night, as the whole town slept, Refugio caught Ramiro murmuring softly to the dog, curled up now beside his chair. "Thank you for not giving up, Centavo. You saw the truth before any of the rest of us did."